In 1536, Anne Boleyn, then Queen of England, was beheaded. The execution was in fact ordered by her own husband, Henry VIII, and it brought to an end only 3 years of queenship and only 3 years of marriage to Henry VIII. So what on earth could possibly have convinced King Henry VIII to have his own wife beheaded? Well, there's a number of factors, but for our purposes, for the exam, for the GCSE, we can perhaps boil it down into the 4 most significant factors. They would be the role of Thomas Cromwell, one of Henry's chief advisors, the role of the Aragon faction at court, those people within the court who had supported Catherine of Aragon, his first wife, and who were still very powerful within the royal court. The role of the Seymour faction, a very powerful faction within court who supported Jane Seymour, one of his future wives. And of course the role of Henry himself. It's easy to remember these 4 factors in the downfall of Anne Boleyn because they spell out the word cash. So let's look at the first one of these factors, the role of Thomas Cromwell. Thomas Cromwell, by then Henry's chief minister, had been one of the central figures in getting Henry VIII the much needed divorce from his first wife, Catherine of Aragon, in order to set up the marriage with Anne Boleyn. However, by 1536, the situation had completely reversed. Henry was no longer in love with Anne Boleyn like he was back in 1533, and in fact, to make matters worse, she had failed to bring him a baby son, an heir to the English throne. In January of 1536, Anne Boleyn had had a miscarriage, and the miscarriage was of a male child. Thomas Cromwell saw this situation as reflecting badly on him. He was the one that had organised the wedding in the first place and had done all of the hard work to allow Henry to marry Anne. He feared that the king would hold him responsible for what had happened since. Henry had always felt that the marriage to Anne Boleyn was condemned by God, that it was cursed by God. He was a very religious man. And Cromwell was fearful that Henry would lay this blame eventually on him as his chief minister. So Cromwell had to do something about this in order to save his own career and in fact to save his own life. So Cromwell decided sometime around April of 1536 that he would join with the Aragon faction, those people who had supported Catherine of Aragon, his first wife, and he would move against Anne Boleyn. He decided to set up an investigation into Anne Boleyn, into her behaviour, in particular into some allegations of the way that she was acting around certain men within the court, including her own brother and a musician called Mark Smeaton. So Cromwell had his own reasons for moving against Anne Boleyn, and he used his power as the chief minister, his connections within the court. He used his connections with the Aragon faction in order to turn the court against Anne. He also used his powers as a lawyer in order to gather evidence against Anne. Evidence, in fact, that she had committed adultery against Henry VIII with at least 5 different men. So that's the role of Thomas Cromwell, a role of self-preservation. The second factor worth considering in the downfall of Anne Boleyn is the influence of the faction of the Aragon family within the royal court. We can call this the Aragonese faction. Catherine of Aragon had been Henry's wife for well over 2 decades, and her influence and the influence of her family and followers in the court was still very strong even after Henry had divorced her and married Anne Boleyn. Of course, the Aragon faction isn't going to see their own power diminished just by the fact that Henry is divorced from Catherine. They want to maintain their power within the court. Secondly, and very importantly, the Aragon faction was predominantly a Catholic faction. They saw Anne Boleyn as a very negative influence on Henry because they believed her to be a Protestant. She was convincing Henry to introduce new ideas into the new Church of England, and they smelt like Protestant ideas. The Aragonese didn't like that. To get rid of Anne Boleyn would not only protect their power within the court, it would also protect the power and importance of Catholic rituals and Catholic beliefs in the Church of England. So the Aragonese faction had every reason to want to see the downfall of Anne Boleyn, and they used their power and privilege and their influence on the king to turn his opinions against his own wife. So that's the second factor. Let's look at the third factor, the role of the Seymour faction. The Seymours were an important and powerful noble family within England who had some power within the royal court. By early 1536, if not even in 1535, many people in the court had noticed how Henry had been treating and acting around Jane Seymour. They realised basically that he fancied her. And so they were going to play on this. It was within the Seymours' interests to remove Anne Boleyn, to turn Henry against her, and to encourage Jane Seymour to curry favour with the king, in order that maybe she might marry him one day and become Queen of England, therefore increasing her own power and the power of her supporters. What gave the Seymours even more hope and encouragement was that in February 1536, Jane Seymour was given private rooms near to the king's. And a few months later, her brother Edward Seymour was appointed to the Privy Chamber. So it was clear for anybody in the royal court that the Seymours were certainly rising up the ranks. They were really earning the attention of Henry VIII. The final factor is the role of King Henry VIII himself. As the king, he had the final decision on whether or not to press forward with the charges that were finally laid against Anne Boleyn. Henry had already begun to feel very differently towards Anne Boleyn after she had failed to bring him a son, and by January of 1536, after the miscarriage, it was clear to Henry that she was never going to bring him a baby son, a male heir to take over the throne. Henry believed very strongly that this was never going to happen, that there was a religious, a divine intervention at play that was stopping her from carrying a son for him. And so he was already beginning to feel like she wasn't the woman for him, and that it was a big mistake. On top of this was the role of Anne herself and her personality. In the beginning, Henry had been attracted to Anne because she was young, she was vivacious, she was flirtatious, and Henry liked that. It was exciting for him after over 2 decades of marriage to his first wife. However, her flirtatiousness and her sexuality had earned her a bit of a reputation at court. There were lots of whispers and rumours about Anne's behaviour, and this was perfect for Thomas Cromwell because he could exploit this and turn it against her. When Thomas Cromwell came to Henry VIII and presented him with the evidence that she had committed adultery by sleeping with various men of the court, including her own relatives, and this very important man, Mark Smeaton, a musician at the court, the evidence was compelling. It convinced Henry. It was a confession from Mark Smeaton. Thomas Cromwell had him arrested and he had him tortured until he confessed that he had had sexual relationship with Anne Boleyn. This was damning evidence, and it was all Henry really needed to have her executed. Adultery by the Queen is, of course, an act of treason. But it was easy also for Henry to believe because he wanted an excuse to get away from Anne. He was convinced she'd never bring him a son. He was convinced that the wedding itself was somehow religiously cursed, and it also already began to have feelings for Jane Seymour. Jane Seymour was very different from Anne Boleyn. She was very demure, she was very sensible, she was very courteous and almost very plain in her behaviour. So to Henry, this was the complete opposite of Anne, and he longed for a woman who was submissive and subservient, who would not cause him any problems in the court. A woman he believed would bring him a son. So there's your 4 main factors in the execution of Anne Boleyn. The role of Thomas Cromwell, the chief minister, the role of the Aragon faction, the role of the Seymours, and finally the role of Henry himself, which also involves the personality of Anne and how this rubbed Henry up the wrong way. Unfortunately, all of these things came together in 1536, and Anne Boleyn, the entirely possibly innocent wife of Henry VIII, who had never committed the sins that she was accused of committing, was executed.